Hey, now joining me now from the UK is Will Kingston, host of the Spectator Australia's Fire at Will podcast. Will, great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me tonight here. I've just been speaking here about the social cohesion problems that we have in the US and in Australia and different sort of ways that's manifesting themselves. But I wanted to talk to you about this other story, which I found really disturbing out of the UK, where Prevent, which is an anti-terror government body, has decided now that people who are conservatively minded, on the right, and who believe things that are of the sort of thing that a lot of people who are watching the show probably think sounds perfectly sensible, like Western culture is under threat from mass migration and lack of integration. Well, that people like this are somehow threats, bigger threats, and should somehow be re-educated. Will, tell me about this and what's going on here in Britain, because didn't the Prime Minister Keir Starmer say something very similar to this the other day when he said the nation was becoming an island of strangers?
Yes, he did, in one of the most cynical plays that I can recall from a politician, given that he's been an open borders, multiculturalism advocate for his entire career. James, it is interesting, and it gets me thinking about this "have we reached the end of woke" conversation. I'm speaking to Andrew Doyle tomorrow. He's saying that we have reached the end of woke. Piers Morgan's got a book out saying pretty much the same thing. My argument would be I don't think we are, because you look at bodies like this, these sorts of quangos, these semi-governmental organisations. Even if the politicians like Keir Starmer start saying the bleeding obvious, that multiculturalism has failed, in fact, it hasn't worked wherever it's been tried, and I include Australia in that, you still have this layer of the bureaucracy in dark corners of Westminster or in Canberra that will continue to push this sort of ideology, often outside of the view of the politicians. And this is why I think, particularly as we look to the future, we've got to start thinking about that sort of administrative layer that sits in Canberra, that sits in the US, that sits in the UK, that will keep pushing this sort of divisive stuff, because they're still committed to it, even if the politicians are now realising, particularly in the UK, that this multicultural ideology is electorally toxic.
Well, and it's really funny, Will, because this sort of thinking manifests itself in so many ways. And I mean, it's Sunday night, so we should have a little bit of lightheartedness here, at least Sunday night here. But there was a story that just shows how the rot of all of this sort of thing, this sort of thinking goes, and how deep it goes. It touches everything. The Michelin guides, the restaurant guide that gives you star ratings, and all the chefs want them. Everyone wants to go to the Michelin-starred restaurants. Well, now they're being urged to decolonize and being told that they're racist. And I also thought this was pretty funny for an organization that rates restaurants that generally cost like $500 or $1,000 a head to go to. They're being accused of being elitist. I mean, tell me about this.
Yeah, welcome to another edition of What's Racist This Week. And these sorts of stories, they pop up every week now. Diets are racist, or punctuality is racist, or climate change is racist. And whenever these stories pop up, I do think, how can someone's psychology bring them to such a silly argument? And the best answer I can come to is for radical identity politics leftists. Race and identity politics more generally is the only prism through which they see the world. So they naturally assume that other people must only see the world through that lens. It's an entirely monocausal way of looking at things. And we don't live in a monocausal world. Like, there is a completely obvious alternative explanation here. And that is, the Michelin Guide doesn't operate in places like Africa or India or in Australia, I might add, because those tourism boards haven't forked out the money in order for Michelin to establish themselves there. But the left doesn't see it that way. It has to be racism. It can't be an alternative. So whenever I have this conversation with one of these Fruit Loops, the first thing is, you will just ask, are there any other alternative explanations for why this is happening as opposed to racism? And look, they probably won't change their views, but at least you've tried to do everything you possibly can to try and get them to think in a more logical way.
Well, but there's a great illogicality at the heart of this, Will, because one of the words that the critics of the Michelin Guide use is that word decolonize. And we hear this word all the time. But of course, it's got this sort of sinister sort of implication because it also kind of says that, well, people are connected to territories. And, on the one hand, the left seems to want this sort of free movement of people, everybody, all around the world. And yet at the same time, they also believe that everybody has this kind of like patch of earth that is theirs, and nobody can cook like people do on that patch of earth, and nobody has a right to live there and settle there. And it seems to me that when you start talking about decolonization, whether it's Israel and all of the horrible violence that's been done in the name of decolonizing, that part of the world, or just in something silly like a restaurant guide, there's a real fundamental problem because it doesn't make sense, these two competing ideas.
Well, James, if you're looking for logical coherence in the leftist argument, I think you're probably
Right,
looking
I
in the wrong
get it.
place,
Yeah,
mate.
yeah.
And I think there is probably, in fairness, an argument that we need to just keep in mind here for places like the Telegraph. This is where I saw that story, and other centre right news organisations, which is it isn't hard to find one loony academic in a university somewhere who's promoting this nonsense. And I think you can then actually start to give it more credence than it actually deserves. This is still not a mainstream view. And despite the fact, and what I think it probably speaks to more, is the ideological corruption of our universities across the West.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the universities. We've seen Donald Trump taking on the universities, and I think he's dead right to do so for that. But, just back to Britain. Let's stick on Britain because that's where you are right now. I have been absolutely shocked that Britain, which was such the leader in the Enlightenment around free speech and ending the idea of blasphemy laws and ending that sort of interference in private conscience, they've prosecuted a man for burning a Koran, which may be an ugly act, but they've prosecuted him in such a way that now people are saying, well, this is tantamount now to an Islamic blasphemy law because you're defaming or you're burning their holy book. Therefore, that's blasphemous to them. So you're imposing a religious law on the British civil common law. Tell us about this, because what I've read here seems very disturbing. Am I right to be disturbed, Will?
Yeah, of course you are. So this is blasphemy laws by the back door. I was shocked actually to learn that blasphemy laws were only decriminalised in the United Kingdom in 2008. But that followed centuries and centuries of classical liberals making the argument that on balance, it's better for people to be allowed to do and say potentially distasteful things, because on balance, that is better than having a government tell you what you can and cannot say. The uncomfortable truth here, James, is that the share of the Islamic population in the United Kingdom has risen overwhelmingly in a very short space of time, and that trend is due to continue. And as a result of that, you have politicians on both sides of the political spectrum who are now abrogating the traditional principles of Western liberal democracies, number one of which is free speech, in favour of appealing a Muslim vote. There are several politicians in the United Kingdom today who are at risk of losing their seats to Islamic candidates. And as a result of that, that's why you're starting to see this sort of appeasement take place. It's incredibly disturbing. I personally don't think that Islam in aggregate is compatible with a Western liberal democracy. And you're seeing more and more examples of that in the United Kingdom today. And unfortunately, there aren't enough politicians who have either the intellect or the courage to be able to stand up and offer an alternative vision. And that vision is of Western liberal democracy, which the United Kingdom, I would argue, has done more than any other country to promote in recent times. This is a very, very sad state of affairs.
I know. When you think about, Mill and Locke and all of the philosophers who came through and granted us this great inheritance, and we're torching it at a rate of knots. Hey, Will, before I let you go, little funny things happening here in Australia. We are in the middle of the King's birthday long weekend. Now, I don't actually think it is the King's birthday tomorrow, but we get this holiday, and I understand that you guys over in the UK don't. What's happening here? Are we subjects here in Australia actually greater monarchists than y'all in the UK?
I actually didn't know that we didn't get the King's birthday holiday in the UK. That's something which is a bit frustrating for me. But look, I think the monarchy is actually in pretty rude health in the United Kingdom at the moment. I think if you put Andrew, Meghan, and Harry to one side, I think the monarchy is strong. I think that the one thing that I would say is is that they need to be cognizant, and particularly Charles needs to be cognizant of politicizing the role. And you are hearing a few murmurs that his sort of, woke, eco-friendly ideology is maybe starting to infiltrate the way that he governs and the sentiment that he puts forward to the nation. Also, I would add his way that he appears to be sympathizing to Islamic members of the country in a way that he is not doing as the defender of the faith of the Christian population. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But on balance, I still think the monarchy is relatively safe in the UK for now.
Well,
Charles I situation, at least.
That's good to hear. And the king is also, I would say, probably one of the best dressed monarchs we've had in a very long time. Will, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much.